British Empire saw this as a way to capitalize on moving Jewish people there, creating a powder keg, and it became a political project increasingly more relevant to the Atlanticist establishment, particularly the British Empire. Now, there was dissension, debate, and disagreements amongst the British elite on this project. Not only is this covered in Quigley and Treasuring Hope and in Anglo-American Establishment, it's also covered in the recent French text that we read, Black Gold Spies, which basically works through all of the British spies at this time who were the key players in the game. T.E. Lawrence, Gertrude Bell, St. John Philby. They were all handled by, or mostly were handled by, the British Bureau of Arab Affairs. That was the cover for British intelligence. The guy that ran the Arab Bureau, British Bureau of Arab Affairs, running all of these spies for British intelligence, was a guy named David Hogarth. And David Hogarth was a round table Fabian socialist person. So once again, we see that when these spies are sent out, by the way, they're sent out for oil. That's the point of this book, is that what was going on was oil reconnaissance. This is the beginning of the discovery of oil. And so the British Empire wanted to capitalize on finding locations in the Middle East and even outside of the Middle East, even at the Persian Gulf. And this is precisely why you get the British Empire having such an important role in Iran and Iran's oil wells through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AOC. Anglo-Iranian Oil Company becomes BP. So once you understand that, you can begin to see why British intelligence and the CIA were so intent on going in and doing a regime change in Iran in the 1950s, 1953 or whatever, to unseat Mohammad Mossadegh, because even though he wasn't a communist, he was pro-Western. He wasn't fully communist. They assumed and thought that he would be much more amenable and useful to the Soviets if they left him in power, and so he needed to be ousted. And this is where we get the Shah, the CIA puppet Shah. And once the Shah fails, the CIA immediately tries to make alliance and agreements with the Ayatollah. If I recall, it's Ayatollah Kashani. But a lot of this is centered around the oil fields that the Iranians had nationalized. So there was a dispute over the amount of money that Iran and BP would get, and America wanted involved as well. And so that led to the oustings. Once the oil was nationalized, British intelligence, working essentially for the Crown and for BP and for all these things, they were not going to stand for it. So at the same time as that's going on in Iran, but prior to that, in these other Middle Eastern countries that are essentially created after the demise of the Ottoman Empire, France and England have a secret agreement called Sykes-Picot, where they divide up the Middle East. And this is where you get most of what we know of as the Middle East today. The British spies that went out, like Gertrude Bell, she went and worked with the Saudis, and she met with Prince Bandar and others, and helped set up the Iraqi elite. And then you get T. Lawrence going and working with and helping to set up the Saudi royal family in Saudi Arabia. So the British Empire literally created what we know of as the Middle East today, together with the French. But the French gradually get pushed out. They have less and less of an influence in the Middle East. So as we come up to then Israel is a very complicated situation. We've covered this many times. You can go watch my previous videos. But essentially, the British set up the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem as an operative there to help foster, at this time, support for and aid for the British project in the Middle East, namely to try to control Mecca. And the British also thought, well, if we could also get a hold of the Holy Land, this would be two very important Islamic sites that, if the British Empire controlled, would allow them to have a lot of power over the entire Islamic world. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, again, a British intelligence creation office that didn't exist until the British created him, ends up, as we saw from the Mark Curtis book, basically helping and fomenting a lot of the tiny mustache men stuff. He meets with SS and others, but really fosters and pushes them to do what the British want. He plays a key role in doing that. He's not the only person involved in that, but in terms of Quigley's thesis, what's happening is that the UK wants World War II. They didn't get what they wanted out of the League of Nations. And when I say they, I mean the Rothschild, Milner, Rhodes, Round Table, Fabian Socialist elite clique, the Royal Institute for International Affairs clique, right? They didn't get the proto-world government out of the League of Nations, which comes out of World War I, that they thought they would get. So the justification for another version would be another world war. Hence, why the British secretly tell Hitler in the appeasement secret deal they want him to go in to do what he does. And so it's all imperial geopolitics. And then once he does this, he goes into Poland, he takes the $2 billion in Czech gold, the Bank of England funds his rise to power. Admittedly, Quigley, it's page 1049 or 1059. Yes. Then they flip. The British say, look how bad he is. You see, he's the monster. We always said he was a monster. And so the British sort of do a double cross. They backstab Tiny Mustache Men that they had a secret appeasement deal with. So it's not so much that necessarily Tiny Mustache Man was a complete agent or complete tool. You can debate to what degree. But the thing that the Royal Society Roundtable Group people are so good at, and you could look at someone like Lord Halford Mackinder, who really sets up modern geopolitical strategy for everyone. The Heartland Theory, the Rimland Theory, controlling Eurasia, etc. These are all out of the British Imperial seafaring nation model. And they have a different model of how you run and control things versus nations that are land powers like Russia or the United States. Those are largely land powers. But England is a tiny little thing, right? It's a tiny little island. How could they control the world? Well, they became a free trade, banking, trade, control the waterways type of structure. And that's what ended up working. I mean, England didn't have some vast standing army, but they had a powerful navy, so much so that this tiny little entity could control an empire. Well, how do you do that if you don't have massive manpower? You do it through brain power and money power and intelligence. And so the British Empire is essentially a kind of an intelligence empire. And one tool in that arsenal was the network of Freemasonry. Another tool in that arsenal was the Anglican Communion, which is, I think, the third largest so-called Christian body after Orthodox. So it's Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and then I think Anglican is the third biggest, quote, communion. And so if you have an empire and you have Anglican missionaries working essentially for the empire, that's another form of the extension of your soft power. And many Anglican ministers were, in fact, Freemasons and were actually spies for the empire as well. So this is very common, very well known, but in history. But a lot of people just simply don't know any of this. They have no idea about any of this stuff. But the reason I'm talking about this is that this is all really important for understanding how we get to Israel where we are now. Another thing that people don't know is that Tiny Mustache Man was interested in going where he was going also for oil and oil fields. Both British and Tiny Mustache Man, the Germans wanted to control the Caucasus oil fields. They wanted access to resources and locations that they could set up bases against Russia. So remember, if you're Germany, you have two main contenders against you: the Anglo-American establishment or the British Empire, depending on how far you go back, and then you have Russia on the other side. Just a little bit of a reminder on this great book. By the way, we have a whole talk for members on Black Gold Spies. So hopefully that helps us get a little bit of a better picture. And by the way, if you doubt any of this, understand my audience is really a kind of an intelligence network on its own, because they recommend to me books that I don't even know exist that just help bolster the case. This one just came in too. This is an official publication from the CFR on the CFR being the successor to the Inquiry. The Inquiry being basically the OSS prior to the OSS. So the OSS is the beginning of America's intelligence apparatus as far as we know it. But prior to that, its predecessor was the Inquiry, a bunch of academics around the time of World War I, right after World War I. And the Inquiry is essentially what becomes the model as well of the Council on Foreign Relations. So they're really intertwined as this sort of governing body of individuals that will steer America. And they don't always agree. So this is one of the mistakes that I think the so-called conspiracy crowd makes, is that they oversimplify by acting like everybody in these councils or these committees or steering committees or roundtable groups, they act like they're all sort of just taking the dictates of Lord Rothschild or whatever. They will have debates, they will have disagreements, but they will come to usually common ground and agreement when it's things that extend the overall agenda. And the overall agenda is essentially a global technocratic Fabian socialist governance model. Now, who will be preeminent within that model, whether it's a neoconservative Americanist empire, whether that's going to die out, whether it's some Israeli dominant empire, I think within this power structure, within these elites, there are competing factions that would like to have the controlling power. It's like mafias get together, they have their meetings. If you've ever watched The Godfather, you see this, right? Where the Godfather goes to the meeting of the Dons, the meeting of the families, right? It's very similar when you have these roundtable groups and whatnot in global steering committee power structures. So hopefully this is helping us to get a picture here.